Welcome, dear listeners, to Miss Marple, Corpse at Ivy Gatehouse, a Miss Marple murder mystery. Settle into your favorite armchair with a cup of tea as we journey to the quaint village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s. Here, amidst blooming gardens and neighborly chats, a puzzling crime unfolds. Our sharp-eyed sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, will unravel the threads with her unmatched wisdom. This cozy tale spans 10 chapters, each about 8 to 10 minutes when narrated. For your convenience, chapter timestamps are included. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Fete and the Fall. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a gentle valley, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the golden light of a summer afternoon in 1952. Honeysuckle perfumed the air, and bees droned lazily over flower beds bursting with roses and lavender. It was the day of the annual village fete, a cherished tradition that drew every soul in St. Mary Mead to the sprawling lawns of Ivy Gatehouse, the grand yet welcoming manor owned by Squire Reginald Hargrove. The house itself stood as a testament to timeless elegance. Its ivy-clad stone walls, weathered by decades, framed tall, mullioned windows that glinted in the sunlight. Beyond the manor, emerald lawns sloped toward a rose garden, where the squire's prize blooms, crimson and blush pink, were the envy of the county. Villagers milled about in their Sunday best, their laughter mingling with the clink of teacups and the cheerful calls of children playing hoop games. Stalls lined the gravel paths, draped in bunting of red, white, and blue, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and bottles of elderflower cordial. The vicar, Mr. Clement, manned a tombola with his usual bumbling charm, while Mrs. Price from the post office presided over a cake. See mysteries everywhere. It's just a fete. Look at the squire. He's positively beaming. Squire Reginald Hargrove, a portly man in his early 60s with a ruddy face and a booming laugh, was indeed the heart of the event. Dressed in a slightly rumpled tweed suit, he moved among the stalls with the ease of a man who knew his place in the world. His pride in Ivy Gatehouse was matched only by his love for his roses, which he tended with a devotion bordering on obsession. "Try this fruit cake, Miss Marple," he called, striding over with a plate. He held out a generous slice, its dark crumbs studded with cherries. "Baked by my dear Eleanor. Divine, isn't it?" Miss Marple accepted the slice with a polite smile, noting the squire's hearty enthusiasm. "Most kind, Squire Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove has outdone herself." She took a delicate bite, her senses attuned not just to the cake's rich flavor, but to the squire's demeanor. There was a slight strain in his laugh, she thought, a touch of effort behind his joviality. Eleanor Hargrove, the squire's wife, stood nearby, elegant in a floral dress that complemented the garden's palette. Her dark hair was swept into a neat chignon, and her smile was gracious, though Miss Marple observed a faint tightness around her eyes, as if she carried a private worry. Eleanor was known for her charity work, organizing the fete with meticulous care, yet today she seemed distracted, her gaze darting toward the tea tent. "Everything all right, Mrs. Hargrove?" Miss Marple asked gently, setting her plate aside. "Oh, yes," Eleanor replied, her voice a touch too bright.
Just ensuring the tea urns are filled. You know how these events are, always a small crisis somewhere. She excused herself and glided toward the tent, her steps quick but measured. Miss Marple's gaze followed her, then shifted to the other figures weaving through the crowd. There was Victor Hargrove, the squire's nephew from London, a slick young man in his 30s with a tailored suit and an air of restless ambition. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead a month ago, ostensibly to visit his uncle, but whispers suggested he had movements, as if she carried a grudge beneath her apron. A stranger caught Miss Marple's eye. Mr. Lionel Thorpe, a man in his late 50s with a thin mustache and a slightly outdated suit. He had introduced himself as an old school friend of the squire's, visiting from Bristol, but his presence seemed to unsettle the villagers. He lingered near the tea tent, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that belied his casual smile. Miss Marple recalled a snippet of gossip from Mrs. Price. Thorpe had dined with the squire the previous evening, and raised voices had been heard from the study. The fete continued in a whirl of laughter and chatter. Children darted through the rose garden, their shrieks mingling with the band's rendition of Green Sleeves. The squire, now at the cake stall, sampled another slice of Eleanor's fruitcake, praising it loudly to Mrs. Price. "Best in the county," he declared, brushing crumbs from his waistcoat. Victor joined him, clapping his uncle on the shoulder, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of impatience in the younger man's eyes. Dr. Croft passed by with a nod, her bag swinging slightly, while Mrs. Finch rearranged plates with meticulous care. Thorpe hovered at the edge of the stall, sipping tea and watching the squire with an unreadable expression. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, a sudden cry shattered the festive hum. Squire Hargrove staggered near the cake stall, his hand clutching his throat. His ruddy face turned ashen, his eyes wide with shock. The plate in his hand clattered to the ground, scattering crumbs. "Eleanor," he gasped, before collapsing in a heap, his tweed suit crumpling like fallen leaves. The crowd froze, gasps rippling outward. Dr. Croft pushed through, kneeling beside him. "Stand back," she ordered, her voice steady but urgent. She checked his pulse, her fingers swift, then shook her head. "He's gone." A murmur of horror swept through the villagers. Miss Marple, rising from her chair, leaned on her walking stick, her eyes narrowing. Dolly clutched her arm. "Jane, what's happening?" Recognizing her knack for unraveling mysteries. "Any thoughts, Miss Marple?" She tilted her head, her eyes scanning the scattered crumbs, the toppled teacup, the faces of the onlookers. "Too early to say, Inspector. But poison is a personal matter, is it not? Hidden in plain sight, like a weed among roses." As the crowd dispersed, whispering in shock, Miss Marple lingered, her mind weaving threads. The fruitcake, so proudly offered by the squire, was the key. Who had access to it? Who had motive? Eleanor, with her strange smile? Victor, with his inheritance dreams? Dr. Croft, with her knowledge of poisons? Mrs. Finch, with her quiet resentment? Or Thorpe, the outsider with secrets? The sun set over St. Mary Mead, casting Ivy Gatehouse in a somber glow. The fete was over, but the mystery had just begun. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea. The morning after the fateful fete, St. Mary Mead awoke under a veil of unease. The sun climbed lazily over the valley, gilding the thatched roofs and dew-kissed hedgerows, but the village's usual cheer was muted. Sparrows chirped half-heartedly, as if sensing the shadow cast by Squire Hargrove's sudden death. In her modest cottage on Mead Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat in her chintz-curtained parlor, the air fragrant with the scent of brewing Darjeeling. Her knitting lay abandoned on the table, a half-finished scarf trailing like an afterthought. Her blue eyes, sharp as ever beneath her white hair, were fixed on the teapot, though her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the faces and moments of the previous day. A knock at the door announced Inspector Craddock, a young policeman from the county force whose earnest demeanor Miss Marple found both endearing and slightly exasperating. He entered, his hat in hand, his face etched with the weight of a murder investigation in a village unaccustomed to such horrors. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair. "I trust you've been thinking about yesterday's tragedy." Miss Marple poured tea, her movements precise. Indeed,
Was seen hovering nearby. Dr. Amelia Croft, our village physician, knows her poisons and was close to the squire during the fete. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, the housekeeper, handled the food trays, including the cake. And Mr. Lionel Thorpe, that odd fellow claiming to be an old friend of the squire's, was spotted lingering by the tea tent. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing slightly. A curious mix. Opportunity is one thing, but motive is the thread that binds the crime. We must look to human nature, Inspector. Its jealousies, its secrets. Meanwhile, at Ivy Gatehouse, the manor stood quiet, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the morning light. Eleanor Hargrove received visitors in the drawing room, a spacious chamber adorned with rosewood furniture and heavy velvet drapes. Her floral dress from the fete had been replaced by a somber gray frock, yet her elegance remained, though her hands trembled as she arranged a vase of roses, her late husband's pride. Dolly Bantry, ever the loyal friend, sat beside her, offering murmured condolences. "It's unthinkable, Eleanor," Dolly said, patting her hand. "Reginald was the soul of this village." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "He had enemies, Dolly. Business rivals, perhaps, from his days in London. But here, in St. Mary Mead, I can't fathom it." Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph of the squire, his ruddy face beaming beside his prize roses. Miss Marple, invited for tea at Dolly's insistence, observed the widow closely. The tremor in Eleanor's hands was not grief alone, she thought. There was fear there, too, like a shadow behind a curtain. Victor Hargrove paced the room, his polished shoes clicking on the parquet floor. His tailored suit, a touch too flashy for village life, marked him as an outsider despite his familial ties. "This is a nightmare," he muttered, running a hand through his slick hair. "Uncle was changing his will, you know. Told me last week. More for charity, less for family. I suppose that makes me look guilt digitalis for the squire's heart condition. But my bottle is accounted for. Locked in my surgery." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And yet, digitalis is so easily gathered from a garden. Tell me, Dr. Croft, do you cultivate foxgloves?" Dr. Croft met her gaze evenly. "I do, for study. But I'm careful, Miss Marple. My plants are no murder weapon." Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted a slight flush on her cheeks, like a schoolgirl caught fibbing. Mrs. Beatrice Finch entered with a tea tray, her gray curls pinned tightly under a cap. Her apron was starched to perfection, but her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying or sleepless. "More tea, ma'am?" she asked Eleanor, her voice low. Miss Marple observed the housekeeper's hands, calloused from years of service, and the way she avoided looking at Victor. "Thank you, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her voice kind but distant.
You've been a rock through this." Mrs. Finch nodded curtly and retreated, but not before Miss Marple caught a flicker of resentment in her expression. "A loyal servant," Miss Marple murmured to Dolly. "But loyalty can hide many things. Like my old maid, Janet, who once broke a teapot and blamed the cat." As the morning wore on, Miss Marple and Dolly strolled to the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea at Ivy Gatehouse. Mrs. Price, behind the counter, leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard something last night," she whispered. "The squire and that Mr. Thorpe had words in the study before the fete. Raised voices. Something about an old debt from their school days." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How interesting. And where was Mr. Thorpe during the fete?" "Skulking by the tea tent," Mrs. Price said, her voice dropping. "Kept watching the squire like a hawk." Later, Miss Marple encountered Thorpe himself outside the shop, his thin mustache twitching as he lit a cigarette. "Terrible business about Hargrove," he said, his tone smooth but guarded. "We were old chums, you know. School days at Harrow. He owed tent, perhaps a distraction." Victor's talk of the will felt too convenient, like a red herring tossed to muddy the waters. Dr. Croft's foxgloves were a point of interest, but her calm professionalism suggested caution, not guilt. Thorpe's debt story, meanwhile, had the ring of a half-truth. Miss Marple set down her cup, her mind weaving threads. "Human nature," she murmured, "is like a village garden, full of beauty, but with thorns beneath." The day was young, and St. Mary Mead held its secrets close, waiting for her to unravel them. Chapter 3. Garden Secrets. The sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through ancient oaks to dapple the gravel paths of Ivy Gatehouse's gardens. 2 days had passed since the tragic fete, and the village, though still whispering of Squire Hargrove's death, had begun to resume its quiet rhythm. The scent of roses and freshly turned earth mingled in the air, a reminder of the squire's beloved blooms, now tended by volunteers in his memory. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the midday glare, strolled the garden paths, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm. Her lavender cardigan was buttoned against a faint breeze, and her sharp blue eyes scanned the flower beds, where foxgloves stood tall, their purple bells swaying like silent sentinels. Miss Marple paused beside a cluster of roses, their petals velvet soft under her touch. "Nature provides such beauty," she murmured to herself, "but also such danger. A foxglove's charm hides its poison, much like human motives." Her thoughts drifted to the squire's death. Digitalis, Dr. Croft had confirmed, slipped into that fateful slice of fruitcake. The question was not only who, but how, and why. Mrs. Beatrice Finch, the Hargroves' housekeeper, was weeding nearby, her gray curls tucked under a faded bonnet. Her apron, dusted with soil, bore the marks of her morning's labor. She straightened as Miss Marple approached, wiping her hands with a briskness that suggested unease. "Good day, Miss Marple. Mother's precious, but I'd never harm him." She turned back to her weeding, her movements jerky. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the foxgloves nearby, their tubular blooms a vivid reminder of the poison. She made a mental note. Mrs. Finch had access to both the cake and the garden, and her resentment, though subtle, was palpable. But was it enough for murder? Dr. Amelia Croft appeared at the garden's edge, her medical bag swinging from her shoulder. Her linen dress bore faint creases from her morning rounds, and her auburn hair glinted in the sunlight. "Miss Marple,"
she greeted, her voice calm but tired. Inspecting the roses, or something more sinister? Miss Marple chuckled softly. Merely admiring the blooms, Doctor. Though I confess these foxgloves intrigue me. You prescribe digitalis for the squire, I understand. Dr. Croft nodded, setting her bag on a stone bench. For his heart condition, yes. A small dose, carefully measured. I checked my surgery this morning. The bottle's untouched, locked away. Whoever poisoned him didn't use my supply. Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple caught a slight hesitation, as if the doctor were guarding a thought. "And your garden, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild. "Do you cultivate foxgloves for your studies?" Dr. Croft's cheeks flushed faintly. "I do, for research into herbal remedies. But I'm meticulous, Miss Marple. My plants are labeled, locked in a shed. I was tending patients during the fête's preparations. No time to tamper with cakes." She adjusted her bag, her fingers brushing a small notebook tucked inside. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Of course. Precision is a doctor's virtue. Though I recall my cousin's gardener who once mixed up his herbs with disastrous results." She noted the notebook, perhaps a record of plants or something more. As Dr. Croft excused herself to visit a patient, Miss Marple continued her stroll, pausing by a small fountain where water trickled over mossy stones. The garden was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead, she thought. Orderly on the surface. His state. But poison? That's not my style. His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted his eyes darted toward the foxgloves, as if they held answers, or accusations. "Money troubles are common," she said, her voice soothing. "My nephew Raymond once borrowed too much for a motor car. It caused quite a stir." She watched Victor closely, noting his quick glance at the manor, where Eleanor Hargrove was visible through a window, arranging flowers. A new figure approached, Mr. Lionel Thorpe, the mysterious visitor claiming to be the squire's old school friend. His outdated suit hung loosely, and his thin mustache twitched as he lit a cigarette. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone overly cordial. "Enjoying the gardens? Hargrove was proud of them. We used to talk botany at Harrow, you know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "How nostalgic. Though I heard you and the squire argued recently. Something about an old debt." Thorpe's hand froze mid-puff. "Village tongues wag, don't they?" "It was nothing, a trifling sum from years ago. I came to reconnect, not to quarrel." His smile was strained, and Miss Marple noted his fidgety fingers, reminiscent of her cousin George when evading a truth. As Thorpe wandered off, claiming a meeting at the village pub, Miss Marple sat on a bench, her mind weaving threads. The garden was a treasure trove of clues, if one knew where to look. She recalled Mrs. Finch's careful handling of the cake tray at the fête, her fingers lingering as if ensuring a specific slice reached the squire. Dr. Croft's notebook intrigued her. Could it hold a recipe for poison? Victor's financial woes were a classic motive, but his openness felt calculated, like a red herring. And Thorpe's old friend story rang hollow. His knowledge of botany suggested familiarity with foxgloves. A subtle clue emerged as she examined the flower beds. Near the foxgloves, a small patch of earth was freshly turned, as if something had been buried or dug up. Miss Marple knelt, her stick probing the soil, and unearthed a tiny glass vial, empty, but smelling faintly of bitter herbs. After Beatrice set it out. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her eyes, like a villager caught in a lie. As Eleanor returned to the manor, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the foxgloves. The vial was a clue, but whose? Mrs. Finch with her garden access? Dr. Croft with her herbal knowledge? Or someone else, planting misdirection like weeds among roses? The village of St. Mary Mead, with its cozy charm, held darker secrets, and Miss Marple knew she was only beginning to unearth them. Chapter 4. False Trails. 4 days after the calamity at Ivy Gatehouse's fete, St. Mary Mead buzzed with a nervous energy, like a hive stirred by an unseen hand. The village green, usually a stage for children's games and idle gossip, now hosted hushed conversations under the shade of ancient elms. The scent of lavender and freshly baked bread drifted from open cottage windows, but the air carried a weight of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched primly atop her white hair, sat on a bench outside the village hall, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Her lavender cardigan was buttoned against a faint morning chill, and her blue eyes, ever observant, traced the comings and goings of villagers as if reading a tapestry of motives. The squire's death by digitalis-laced fruitcake had shaken St. Mary Mead to its core, and Inspector Craddock's investigation was in full swing. Miss Marple, though not officially involved, found herself drawn into the puzzle, her mind sifting through the clues unearthed so far. Mrs. Finch's careful handling of the cake tray, Dr. Croft's foxglove studies, Victor's talk of a changed will, Thorpe's dubious debt story, and the mysterious vial found in the garden. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is like a village path, well-trodden, yet full of unexpected turns. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dolly Bantry, her cheeks flushed from a brisk walk. "Jane, you'll never believe the talk at the post office," Dolly said, settling beside her. "They're saying Victor Hargrove strained. I'm trying to make sense of Reginald's affairs. It's overwhelming." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting in her lap. "Grief is a heavy burden, Mrs. Hargrove. I noticed a letter fall earlier, something from a London solicitor, perhaps?" Eleanor's fingers froze, and a letter slipped to the floor, its wax seal broken. "Oh, just business matters," she said quickly, retrieving it. But Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a glimpse of the words "divorce proceedings" before Eleanor tucked it away. "Reginald was distant lately," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "He had secrets, old promises broken. But I loved him, despite it all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Love is complex, like my Aunt Matilda's embroidery, knots beneath the beauty. Did anyone else know of these troubles?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. "Victor might have. He was always prying into Reginald's plans." Her words were soft, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of fear, as if Eleanor regretted speaking. The investigation took a new turn when Inspector Craddock summoned Victor to the village hall for questioning. Miss Marple, invited to observe, sat quietly in a corner, her knitting a shield for her scrutiny. Victor, his slick hair slightly disheveled, faced Craddock with a forced calm. "Yes, I argued with Uncle," he admitted, his hands fidgeting with his cigarette case. "I'm in debt. London's expensive. I asked for a loan, not his estate. But poison. I'm no chemist." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Yet you were near the cake stall, Mr. Hargrove, and you knew about the will change. Convenient, don't you think?" Victor's jaw tightened. "I'm not the only one with troubles. Ask Thorpe about his so-called friendship with Uncle. They weren't exactly chummy at Harrow." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly,
Victor's deflection was bold, but was it truth or misdirection? She recalled her nephew Raymond, who once deflected blame to avoid a scolding. A red herring, perhaps, but one word
confirmed it contained only sugar syrup, a relic from a previous physician. Yet the discovery stirred the village, with whispers pointing to Dr. Croft's expertise in poisons. Miss Marple, however, suspected a deliberate plant, designed to mislead. "Red herrings," she murmured to Dolly over tea at the vicarage, "are as common as dandelions in a mystery." The vicarage tea was interrupted by Mr. Lionel Thorpe, who arrived uninvited, his outdated suit rumpled from a morning walk. His mustache twitched as he accepted a cup from the vicar, Mr. Clement, whose kindly demeanor softened the tense atmosphere. "I hear the village is pointing fingers," Thorpe said, his tone light but guarded. "I assure you my quarrel with Hargrove was trivial, a schoolboy debt, long forgotten." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yet you were seen in the garden at odd hours, Mr. Thorpe." "Collecting herbs," a neighbor said. "For what purpose?" Thorpe's smile faltered. "Just a hobby. I dabble in botany, nothing sinister." His fingers tapped his saucer, a nervous tick. Miss Marple recognized from her cousin George, who fidgeted when cornered. As Thorpe left, Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning to the vial from the garden. She had shown it to Craddock, who confirmed it held traces of digitalis, but its origin remained elusive. Was it Mrs. Finch's, hidden after a moment of panic? Dr. Croft's, misplaced during her studies? Or a clever plant by Victor or Thorpe? Eleanor's mention of divorce papers added another layer. Had the squire's secrets driven someone to murder? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the evening light casting shadows on her chintz curtains. She recalled a moment at the fete, a child spilling tea near the cake stall, while Mrs. Finch rearranged the trays. Was it a planned distraction? Victor's debts and Thorpe's botany knowledge were compelling, but too obvious, like a poorly knitted. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Study. A week had passed since the ill-fated fete at Ivy Gatehouse, and St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm, like a pond rippled by a hidden current. The village's thatched cottages glowed under the soft October light, their chimneys puffing gentle smoke. But whispers of murder lingered in the tea rooms and lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender cardigan buttoned against the crisp morning air, made her way to Ivy Gatehouse, her walking stick tapping a thoughtful rhythm on the gravel path. Her straw hat sat neatly atop her white hair, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, from the dew-glistened cobwebs to the fleeting glances of passers-by. The squire's death by digitalis-laced fruitcake remained unsolved, and Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving threads of clues. Mrs. Finch's lingering hands at the cake stall, Dr. Croft's foxglove studies, Victor's debts, Thorpe's dubious past, and the mysterious vial from the garden. The Manor's study, where she now stood, was a sanctuary of oak and leather, its air heavy with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. Sunlight slanted through mullioned windows, casting shadows across a cluttered desk where Squire Hargrove once managed his affairs. Miss Marple, invited by Eleanor Hargrove to lend a comforting presence, surveyed the room with quiet intent. Her knitting rested in her lap, a pretext for her presence, as she examined the desk. Ledgers, a fountain pen, a half-eaten cake crumb oddly untouched by poison, and a small photograph of the squire amid his roses. Eleanor entered, her gray frock pristine but her face drawn, as if sleep had eluded her. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I'm sorting Reginald's things. It's difficult." She gestured to a pile of papers, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Grief is a heavy thread to unravel, Mrs. Hargrove. I noticed a letter yesterday, something about divorce. Did it trouble you greatly?" "Nights." "Tea, ma'am?" she asked Eleanor, her voice low and strained. Miss Marple observed her calloused hands, which lingered on the tray as if reluctant to let it go. "Thank you, Beatrice," Eleanor said, her tone kind but distant. As Mrs. Finch set out the cups, Miss Marple recalled her at the fete, rearranging the cake slices with unusual care. "Mrs. Finch," she said conversationally. "The squire was particular about his possessions, wasn't he? I heard he accused you of misplacing a brooch once." Mrs. Finch's lips tightened, and a teacup rattled faintly in her hand. "He did, miss. A family heirloom, he said. Found it in his own pocket later, but he never apologized. Called me careless." Her voice held a bitter edge, and Miss Marple noted her quick glance at Eleanor, as if gauging her reaction. "A small slight, but they sting," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "My old maid, Janet, once broke a vase and blamed the cat. Loyalty can wear thin under such pressures." Mrs. Finch nodded curtly and retreated, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of resentment in her eyes, like a spark in dry grass. The housekeeper's access to the cake and garden made her a compelling figure, but was her grudge deep enough for murder? Dr. Amelia Croft arrived shortly after, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Her linen dress bore faint grass stains, and her auburn hair was pinned neatly, though a strand escaped, betraying her fatigue. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Hargrove," she greeted, declining tea. "I've just come from the inspector. He's still fussing over that bottle in my surgery. Sugar syrup of all things. A waste of time." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes on Dr. Croft's bag, where a small notebook peeked out. "The autopsy must have been revealing, Doctor. Digitalis, I understand. A precise dose." Dr. Croft nodded, her expression guarded. "Very precise. Not amateur work. Someone knew exactly how much to use. The squire's heart condition made him vulnerable, but this was her gloves to lift the tin. Like the time Mrs. Bates found a smudged glass and learned it was polished to hide a mark." Victor Hargrove burst into the room, his slick hair disheveled and his tie askew. "Miss Marple, have you seen Eleanor? She's not herself." His voice was urgent, but his eyes darted to the desk, lingering on the papers. "This business with the will, it's nonsense. Uncle was helping me with a loan, not cutting me out." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Generosity is a fine quality, Mr. Hargrove. Though I heard you mentioned a business rival in London. Someone who might have wished your uncle harm." Victor's jaw tightened. "Just a rumor. Some property deal gone sour. I told Craddock to look into it. Keeps him busy." His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noted his restless hands, much like her nephew Raymond when deflecting blame. The mention of a London rival sent Inspector Craddock on a wild goose chase, telephoning contacts in the city, but Miss Marple suspected it was another false trail. Victor's eagerness to point elsewhere felt calculated, like a red herring tossed into the pond. She recalled the vial from the garden,
Traces of digitalis, but no owner. Was it a careless mistake or a deliberate plant? Later at the village shop, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price whispering to a customer. "They say Mrs. Finch was seen in the manor's pantry before the fete, handling bottles. Could have been poison, couldn't it?" The rumor was tantalizing, but Miss Marple knew gossip was like her knitting, full of loops that led nowhere. Back in the study, Miss Marple sat alone, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped. She examined the photograph of the squire, noting a faint mark on the frame, a smudge like the one on the cake tin. Her mind turned to Eleanor's divorce papers, Mrs. Finch's resentment, Dr. Croft's notebook, and Victor's debts. Thorpe's absence today was notable. His botany hobby and garden visits lingered in her thoughts. The vial, the smudges, and the rumors were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still blurred. As she left the manor, Miss Marple paused by the rose garden, where the foxgloves stood silent.
Whispers of murder wove through the village like ivy, clinging to every conversation. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the midday sun, sat in the vicarage parlor, her lavender cardigan buttoned neatly. Her knitting needles clicked a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Her sharp blue eyes, hidden behind a benign smile, traced the faces of those gathered, each a thread in the tangled mystery of Squire Hargrove's death by digitalis-laced fruitcake. The vicar, Mr. Clement, had invited the key figures for tea, hoping to ease tensions in the wake of the investigation. His kindly demeanor, like a warm hearth, softened the room's unease. But Miss Marple sensed undercurrents, like ripples beneath a calm stream. The parlor was cozy, with chintz curtains and a tray of scones, but the air held a tang of suspicion. Her mind sifted through clues. Mrs. Finch's careful handling of the cake tray, Dr. Croft's foxglove notebook, Victor's debts, Thorpe's dubious botany, the garden vial, and the smudged cake tin from the study. People, she murmured to herself, are like village gossip, full of half-truths, yet revealing if you listen closely. Eleanor Hargrove sat near the window, her gray frock immaculate, but her face pale, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "It's kind of you, Mr. Clement," she said, her voice soft but strained, "to bring us together. This ordeal has been dreadful." Her eyes flickered to the others, and Miss Marple noted a guardedness, as if Eleanor feared her own words. Victor Hargrove lounged in an armchair, his slick London suit slightly rumpled, his hands fidgeting with a cigarette case. "Dreadful's an understatement," he muttered, his tone sharp. "The inspector's hounding me over that argument with Uncle. As if I'd poison him over a loan." His eyes darted to Eleanor, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting look. Anger or guilt? Squire's alleged school friend arrived late, his outdated suit creased from a morning walk. His thin mustache twitched as he accepted a cup from Mr. Clement. "A fine gathering," he said, his tone overly genial. "Though I suspect we're all under scrutiny, Miss Marple?" His smile was strained, and Miss Marple noted his fidgety fingers, a tic she'd seen in her cousin George when dodging truth. The conversation turned to the fete, and tensions flared. Eleanor's voice sharpened as she addressed Thorpe. "You threatened Reginald that night in the study, didn't you? I heard raised voices, something about money owed." Her accusation hung in the air, and the room stilled.
Thorpe's cup rattled in its saucer. Mere words, Mrs. Hargrove. A schoolboy debt long forgotten. I came to reconnect, not to quarrel. His denial was swift, but Miss Marple caught his glance at Victor, as if seeking an ally. Victor leaned forward, his voice low. Don't drag me into this, Thorpe. You're the one who was skulking in the garden, picking herbs. What were you brewing? His tone was accusing, and Miss Marple noted a subtle nod from Dr. Croft, as if they shared a secret. Dr. Croft's cheeks flushed. Enough, Victor. I've had my fill of accusations. My foxgloves are for research, not poison. She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. You understand, don't you? I was with patients during the FET setup. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Of course, Doctor. Though I recall my cousin's gardener who mistook foxgloves for comfrey. Mistakes can be revealing. She watched Dr. Croft's fingers tighten on her bag and Victor's quick glance at Thorpe. An alliance, perhaps, or another misdirection. Mr. Clement, sensing the tension, offered more scones, but the gesture did little to ease the strain. A new clue emerged when Dolly Bantry, who had joined the gathering, leaned toward Miss Marple. Jane, I heard something at the shop, she whispered. An anonymous letter was sent to the inspector, claiming Mrs. Finch was real, and her access to the cake tray undeniable. Eleanor's accusation against Thorpe suggested personal knowledge, perhaps tied to the divorce papers. Victor and Dr. Croft's whispered glances hinted at a shared secret, perhaps a business deal, or something darker. Thorpe's botany hobby remained suspicious, especially after his garden visits. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the village green, where children played under the elms, their laughter a stark contrast to the vicarage's tension. She recalled a case from her youth, where a jealous maid had spread rumors to deflect blame. Misdirection, she murmured, is the murderer's art, like a conjurer's trick. The letter, the alliances, and the accusations were smoke, obscuring the truth. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her chintz-curtained window, her knitting in her lap. She reviewed the clues, the vial's bitter scent, the smudged tin, Eleanor's fear, and the letter's convenient timing. A memory from the fete surfaced. A child's spilled tea had drawn Eleanor away, but Victor had lingered near the cake stall, his hand brushing the tray. Was it a distraction or coincidence? Dr. Croft's notebook, glimpsed again today, held sketches of plants, foxgloves among them. Thorpe's school friend story felt flimsier with each telling, his botany knowledge a potential key. A new rumor reached her via a note from Dolly. A villager claimed to have seen Thorpe and Victor whispering in the pub, discussing a plan. Miss Marple frowned, her needles clicking faster. Plans can be innocent, she mused, like my nephew Raymond's surprise party. But they can also hide thorns. The vicarage had revealed alliances and accusations, but the truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers of misdirection. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving threads. The anonymous letter, Victor's debts, and Thorpe's botany were false trails, yet each held a grain of truth. Mrs. Finch's locket and Eleanor's fear were clues to deeper motives. The truth, she murmured. Eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, sifted through the clues of Squire Hargrove's murder. The digitalis-laced fruitcake, Mrs. Finch's lingering hands, Dr. Croft's notebook, Victor's debts, Thorpe's botany, the garden vial, the smudged cake tin, and the anonymous letter from the vicarage. Truth, she murmured,
is like a garden. It requires patience to uncover what lies beneath. Her mind turned to the vicarage tea, where accusations had flown like sparks. Eleanor's claim against Thorpe, Victor's pointed jab at Dr. Croft, and Mrs. Finch's trembling locket. The anonymous letter accusing the housekeeper felt too neat, a deliberate misdirection. Yet, each suspect held a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple sensed the threads were beginning to align. Her musings were interrupted by Inspector Craddock, who arrived with a purposeful stride, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, settling on a garden bench. "I've a new lead, but I'd value your thoughts. We found a ledger in the squire's study, a record of payments to Mrs. Finch, marked extra duties. Odd, don't you think, for a housekeeper?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling. "Very odd, Inspector. Like my cousin's gardener. Paid extra for tending roses he never planted. What duties, I wonder?" She recalled Mrs. Finch's resentment over the squire's scolding, a misplaced brooch, a teacup, and the pantry rumor. The ledger suggested a deeper connection, perhaps a secret kept or betrayed. Craddock flipped open his notebook. "There's more. The vial from the garden. It's a medical type, used for liquid extracts. Dr. Croft says it's not hers, but it matches bottles in her surgery. And Victor's London debts? They're tied to a property deal the squire backed, now collapsed. He's in deeper than he let on." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. A vial, a ledger, and debts. All threads in a tap. "Burdens," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Did anyone else know of this plan? Victor, perhaps, or Mrs. Finch?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering to the altar. "Victor suspected. He was furious, said it would ruin his plans. Beatrice, she overheard us arguing. She was loyal, but Reginald's demands wore her down." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple sensed a truth half-spoken, like her cousin Clara's evasions. As Eleanor left, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drawn to a hymn book left open on a pew. Tucked inside was a scrap of paper, a recipe for fruitcake in Mrs. Finch's precise handwriting, with a curious note: "Add extra spice, as per squire's taste." Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket, her heart quickening. "Spice," she murmured, "or something more sinister, like the time Mrs. Bates hid a recipe to cover a mistake." That afternoon, Miss Marple met Dr. Amelia Croft at her surgery, a tidy room lined with medical texts and herb jars. Dr. Croft's auburn hair was pinned neatly, but her linen dress bore faint ink stains, suggesting restless work. "Miss Marple," she greeted, her voice steady but tired. "I suppose you're here about that vial. I've told Craddock. It's not mine. My bottles are labeled, accounted for." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes on the notebook protruding from Dr. Croft's bag. "Precision is a doctor's virtue, Dr. Croft. Yet that notebook of yours, does it record only remedies or something more? I recall my cousin's gardener, whose notes hid a secret crop." Dr. Croft's cheeks flushed. "Just plants, Miss Marple. Foxgloves, yes, but for study. I was sketching at the fete, not poisoning cakes." She opened the notebook, revealing detailed drawings of plants, including a foxglove labeled medicinal. Miss Marple noted a smudged page, as if hastily closed, and a faint scent of bitter herbs, like the vial. Victor Hargrove appeared at the surgery door, his slick hair disheveled, his tie askew. "Miss Marple, any progress? The inspector's hounding me about that property deal."
It was Uncle's idea.
And Miss Marple noted the eagerness, like her neighbor's love of scandal. "Gossip is a tangled thread," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But we must follow it." She recalled Thorpe's botany hobby and his fidgety denials at the vicarage. Was he planting evidence or being framed? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the evening light casting shadows on her chintz curtains. She examined the recipe scrap, its extra spice note intriguing. The ledger's extra duties for Mrs. Finch suggested a hidden role, perhaps handling the squire's medicines. Dr. Croft's smudged notebook and Victor's failed deal pointed to financial pressures, while Thorpe's pantry sighting was another false trail, too convenient to trust. Eleanor's locket and her fear of the charity sale hinted at a deeper motive, perhaps tied to the manor itself. A memory from the fete surfaced. Mrs. Finch's hands, rearranging the cake tray, had paused over one slice, as if marking it. Was it deliberate, or a servant's habit? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. "The truth," she murmured, "is like a rose's roots, deep and hidden, but traceable." The clues were aligning, and St. Mary Mead's secrets were unraveling, one delicate thread at a time. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Thread. 17 days after the fateful fete at Ivy Gatehouse, St. Mary Mead's shimmered under a crisp October sky, its cottages aglow with the last of the autumn roses. The village's charm, its winding lanes and chimneys puffing like contented pipe smokers, masked a lingering unease, as if the hedgerows themselves whispered of murder. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the morning sun, sat in her cottage parlor, the scent of brewing Darjeeling mingling with the faint must of old books. Her lavender cardigan was buttoned neatly, and her knitting needles clicked a steady rhythm, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Her sharp blue eyes, veiled by a gentle smile, sifted through the clues of Squire Hargrove's death, the digitalis laced fruit settling into a chintz chair. "Mrs. Price says a villager saw Mrs. Finch burning papers in the manor's garden last night, behind the foxgloves no less. Could it be evidence?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling. "Burning papers is curious, Dolly. Like my cousin Clara, who burned a letter to hide a secret. We must see what Mrs. Finch was so eager to destroy." She recalled the housekeeper's trembling locket and her resentment over the squire's scolding. A brooch, a teacup, now papers. The threads were tightening. Miss Marple visited Ivy Gatehouse that afternoon, where Inspector Craddock was examining the garden's ash pile, a faint scorch mark amid the roses. His earnest face was creased with frustration. "Miss Marple," he greeted, brushing soot from his hands. "We found charred scraps, letters maybe, but too damaged to read. Mrs. Finch admits she burned old bills, claims they were clutter. But why here, near the foxgloves?" Miss Marple leaned on her stick, her eyes scanning the flower beds. "A gardener's choice, perhaps, or a guilty one. Did the scraps mention the squire?" She noted a faint glitter in the ash, a metal clasp like a locket's half buried. She slipped it into her pocket, her heart quickening. Like the time Mrs. Bates burned a recipe, only to reveal a hidden note. Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "There's more. We traced the vial's design. It's from a batch Dr. Croft ordered last year, though she swears it's not hers. And Victor's property deal? The squire pulled out,
leaving him owing thousands. He's been selling family heirlooms to cover it. Eleanor confirmed a missing brooch. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A brooch, you say? Mrs. Finch mentioned one, misplaced by the squire. Curious how clues intertwine. She recalled Victor's restless hands at the vicarage, his glance at Dr. Croft. An alliance, or a shared secret? At the manor, Miss Marple found Eleanor. Red-rimmed eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of defiance. "Tea, miss?" she asked, her voice low. Miss Marple observed her hands, calloused yet steady, lingering on the teapot as they had on the cake tray at the fete. "Thank you, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "I heard you were burning papers in the garden. Old bills or something more personal? My cousin Clara once burned a diary to hide a quarrel." Mrs. Finch's lips tightened, and a cup rattled faintly. "Just clutter, miss. The squire left papers everywhere, receipts, notes. I was tidying." Her voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted her fingers brush a locket at her throat, identical to the clasp in the ash. "A loyal servant's task," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Though loyalty can strain, like my maid Janet's after a scolding." She watched Mrs. Finch retreat, her steps quick, as if fleeing scrutiny. Dr. Amelia Croft arrived later, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, her linen dress creased from a morning's rounds. Her auburn hair was pinned, but a strand betrayed her fatigue. "Miss Marple," she said, declining tea. "Craddock's still on about that vial. It's not mine. I order in bulk, but I track every bottle. Someone took it from my surgery." Her tone was firm, but her fingers brushed her notebook, smudged with ink. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Your notebook intrigues me, Doctor. Those sketches, foxgloves, yes? I recall my cousin's gardener, whose notes hid a dangerous recipe." She noted Dr. Croft's flush, a sign of nerves or indignation. "It's research," Dr. Croft insisted, opening the notebook to reveal a foxglove sketch labeled therapeutic dose. "I was studying digitalis properties, not brewing poison." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple caught a faint scent of bitter herbs, like the vial, lingering on the pages. Victor Hargrove burst into the room, his slick hair disheveled, his tie askew. "Miss Marple, this is madness. Craddock's digging into my debts. Uncle—" "Poison." Her eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple recognized the thrill of gossip, like her neighbor's love of scandal. "Parcels can be innocent," Miss Marple said, "but we must follow the thread." Thorpe's botany and late-night visits were suspicious, yet too obvious, like a red herring stitched into the narrative. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the dusk casting shadows on her chintz curtains. She examined the locket clasp, its rose engraving matching Mrs. Finch's. The recipe's extra spice, the ledger's payments, and Eleanor's charity revelation pointed to Mrs. Finch's access to digitalis. Victor's debts and Dr. Croft's notebook were compelling, but Thorpe's parcel felt staged. A memory from the fete surfaced. Mrs. Finch's hands, pausing over one cake slice, as if ensuring it reached the squire. "The truth," she murmured, "is like a rose's petals, layered, but revealing when peeled." St. Mary Mead's secrets were unraveling, and Miss Marple was close to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 9. The Hidden Motive. 3 weeks after the tragic fete at Ivy Gatehouse, St. Mary Mead lay bathed in the soft glow of an October dusk,
its cottages winking with lamplight as chimney smoke curled into the evening sky. The village's cozy charm, its hedgerows dusted with fading roses and lanes echoing with the crunch of leaves, masked a persistent unease, like a melody played in a minor key. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat resting on a side table, sat by her cottage window, the scent of chamomile tea blending with the faint lavender of her cardigan. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm that matched her careful thoughts. Her sharp blue eyes, veiled by a gentle smile, sifted through the clues of Squire Hargrove's murder. The digitalis-laced fruitcake, Mrs. Finch's deliberate handling of the tray, Dr. Croft's smudged notebook, Victor's debts, Thorpe's botany, the garden vial, the smudged cake tin, the anonymous letter. Clasp. It matches one she wears, engraved with a rose. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling. A promise, Inspector? Like my cousin Clara's vow to a friend, kept secret until it unraveled. What did the squire owe Mrs. Finch? She recalled the housekeeper's trembling hands, her resentment over scoldings, a brooch, a teacup, and her role with the squire's medicines. Craddock nodded, flipping a page. There's more. The vial's glass matches Dr. Croft's surgery, but it's an older batch, possibly stolen. And Victor? His debts are worse than we thought. He sold a Hargrove heirloom, a silver tray, to a London dealer. Eleanor's furious, says it was her mother's. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. A stolen tray, a stolen vial, a broken promise. All threads in a tapestry. But we must untangle the knots, Inspector. She pictured Mrs. Finch's locket, its rose engraving echoing the clasp, and the recipe's extra spice, perhaps a code for digitalis. Later, Miss Marple visited the village hall, where a charity meeting was underway, a nod to the squire's legacy. Eleanor Hargrove stood at the podium, her gray frock immaculate, but her face pale, her hands clutching a rose-embossed locket. Reginald's vision was for orphans, she said, her voice trembling. Ivy Gatehouse was to fund it, but I couldn't bear to lose our home. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and a flicker of guilt passed through them, like a cloud over the sun. Miss Marple approached after the meeting, her stick tapping softly. Mrs. Hargrove, your devotion to the manor is touching. Did Mrs. Finch know of this plan? She seemed close to the squire's affairs. Eleanor's fingers tightened on her locket. Beatrice managed his medicines, his digitalis drops. She was loyal, but Reginald's demands. He promised her a pension, then delayed it. She was hurt. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her eyes, as if Eleanor dreaded exposing too much. As Eleanor left, Miss Marple lit cousin's gardener once lent a book, and it caused quite a stir. Dr. Croft's cheeks flushed. I showed it to Victor once. He was curious about herbs. But it's just research, Miss Marple. She flipped to a page revealing a foxglove labeled cardiac use, but Miss Marple noted a torn edge as if a page had been removed and a faint bitter scent, like the vial. Victor Hargrove appeared at the door, his slick hair disheveled, his tie askew. Miss Marple, this is absurd. Craddock's on about that tray. I sold it to save my business, not to kill Uncle. His eyes darted to Dr. Croft, and Miss Marple recalled their whispered glance at the vicarage, a hint of collusion. Desperation drives many actions, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Like my nephew Raymond's rash investments. Did you know of Mrs. Finch's pension, or the squire's medicines? Victor's jaw tightened.
She was always fussing with his drops. Thought herself his nurse. His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted his glance at the notebook, quickly averted. The investigation took a turn when Miss Marple visited the village shop, where Mrs. Price leaned over the counter, her eyes gleaming. "Miss Marple, they say Mr. Thorpe was seen with a chemist in Much Benham before the fete, buying bottles, perhaps?" Her voice dropped, and Miss Marple recognized the thrill of gossip, like her neighbor's love of scandal. "Bottles can be innocent," Miss Marple said, "but we must follow the thread." Thorpe's botany and late-night visits were suspicious, yet too convenient, like a red herring woven into the narrative. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her chintz-curtained window, examining the locket clasp and recipe scrap. The clasp's rose matched Mrs. Finch's locket, suggesting a personal tie to the squire, perhaps the promise in the burned papers. The recipe's extra spice could mask digitalis, and Mrs. Finch's role with the squire's medicines gave her access. Victor's debts and Dr. Croft's torn page were compelling, but Thorpe's chemist visit felt staged. Eleanor's fear of losing the manor hinted at a motive, but her grief
sat in her cottage parlor. The faint scent of chamomile tea mingling with the lavender of her neatly buttoned cardigan. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm that echoed her meticulous thoughts. Her sharp blue eyes, softened by a gentle smile, sifted through the clues of Squire Hargrove's murder. The digitalis-laced fruitcake, Mrs. Finch's deliberate handling of the tray, Dr. Croft's smudged notebook, Victor's debts, Thorpe's botany, the garden vial, the smudged cake tin, the anonymous letter, the ledger's extra duties, the burned papers, and the rose-embossed locket clasp, the recipe scrap's extra spice note, and Eleanor's fear of losing the manor were threads nearing a knot. "Truth," she murmured, "is like a rose's thorn, sharp, hidden, but impossible to ignore once found." Her mind returned to the village hall, where the fete photo had shown Mrs. Finch's hand pausing over a cake slice, Victor nearby, and Eleanor distracted by spilled tea. The locket clasp, matching Mrs. Finch's, and the burned paper's promise suggested a personal betrayal. The truth was close, but one final thread needed pulling. A knock announced Dolly Bantry, her eyes bright with news. "Jane, you won't believe it," she said, settling into a chintz chair. "Mrs. Price swears she saw Mrs. Finch at the manor's back gate the night before the fete, passing a small parcel to someone. A man, she thinks, in a dark coat. Could it be Thorpe?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling. "A parcel, Dolly. Like my cousin Clara's secret gift, which hid a deeper truth. We must learn who received it." She recalled Mrs. Finch's trembling locket, her role with the squire's medicines, and the burned papers. Was the parcel the vial, or another misdirection? Miss Marple visited Ivy Gatehouse that morning. Victor called. She pictured Victor's restless hands, his whispered glance with Dr. Croft at the vicarage, and Mrs. Finch's locket, its rose echoing the clasp. At the manor's drawing room, Miss Marple found Eleanor Hargrove arranging roses, her gray frock pristine but her face etched with worry. Her fingers clutched her locket, its rose engraving glinting. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice brittle, "this house feels like a tomb.
Reginald's charity plan. I should have supported it, but I couldn't lose Ivy Gatehouse. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. A home is a heavy anchor, Mrs. Hargrove. Did Mrs. Finch share your fear? Her role with the squire's medicines gave her access, I hear. Eleanor's eyes widened. Beatrice? She mixed his digitalis drops, knew his doses by heart. But she was loyal, despite his delays with her pension. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted a tremor, as if Eleanor feared her own words. Mrs. Beatrice Finch entered with a tea tray, her gray curls pinned tightly, her apron spotless. Her red-rimmed eyes met Miss Marple's with a flicker of defiance. "Tea, ma'am?" she asked, her hand steady but lingering on the teapot, as they had on the cake tray. "Thank you, Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "I heard you were at the back gate before the fete, passing a parcel. A recipe, perhaps, or something more? My cousin Clara once hid a gift to avoid questions." Mrs. Finch's lips tightened, and a cup rattled faintly. "Just old linens, miss, for the church sale, nothing more." Her voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted her fingers brush the locket, its rose engraving matching the clasp in her pocket. As Mrs. Finch retreated, Miss Marple visited Dr. Croft's surgery, where the doctor was cataloging herbs. Her auburn hair was pinned, but her linen dress bore ink stains, betraying restless work. Her notebook lay open, a foxglove sketch visible. "Miss Marple," Dr. Croft said, her voice weary. "Craddock's still on about that vial. It's not mine. I'd never be so careless." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Careless
Medicines." Victor's jaw tightened. She was always mixing his drops, thought herself indispensable. His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted his glance at the locket clasp in her hand, quickly averted. Later, at the village green, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price whispering to a customer. "They say Mr. Thorpe was seen at the manor's gate, taking that parcel from Mrs. Finch. Could it be poison?" Her eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple recognized the thrill of gossip, like her neighbor's love of scandal. "Gossip is a tangled thread," Miss Marple said. "But we must trace it." Thorpe's botany and late-night visits were suspicious, yet too convenient, like a red herring sewn into the plot. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her chintz-curtained window, examining the locket clasp and recipe scrap. The clasp's rose matched Mrs. Finch's locket, tying her to the burned paper's promise, perhaps a pension denied. The recipe's extra spice could hide digitalis, and her role with the squire's medicines gave her opportunity. Victor's debts and Dr. Croft's torn page were compelling, but Thorpe's parcel felt staged. Eleanor's fear of losing the manor was real, but her grief seemed genuine. So, a memory from the fete sharpened. Mrs. Finch's hand, pausing over the cake slice as Victor watched, and Eleanor was drawn away. Was it a planned act? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. "The thorn," she murmured, "is the motive, sharp and hidden, but piercing." St. Mary Mead's secrets were unraveling, and Miss Marple was poised to reveal the rose's heart.